I didn't invent this market position. We basically borrowed it or stole it from Berkshire Hathaway, and we find a lot of opportunities. I think many PE firms are sometimes too rigid in both their approach to deals and opportunities, so they just have a really, really tightly defined box, which I understand why they have that. Extreme ownership's one of my all-time favorites. I've given that to the management teams of a couple different businesses of ours over time as well. I think it's a really good read.
Welcome back to the Raw Selection Private Equity Podcast. On the podcast today is Matt Bodnar, founder and managing partner of Eidolon Capital, a private equity firm located in Nashville, Tennessee. We're going to discuss lots of stuff from deal origination to using direct mail, all sorts of different pieces, but I highly recommend, this sounds like some kind of podcast plug, highly recommend you wait till the end and stay tuned because he has a ton of book and content recommendations, and I've written down 6 different things. So please stay tuned right to the end to make sure you get that, because there's huge amounts of values learned from Charlie Munger and also Warren Buffett and various different other people on human psychology, on investing and other bits. So let's dive in, and thank you very much, Matt, for coming onto the podcast. Matt, if you can share a brief insight into you, please.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thanks for having me on here. My background's pretty simple. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I worked at Goldman Sachs up in New York for a number of years out of school. Came back to Nashville in 2011 and bought my first business, and really been a private equity investor since then through a couple of different iterations and companies. And today have a platform called Eidolon Capital with a number of holdings ranging from software, technology, manufacturing, distribution, a handful of other kind of miscellaneous investments. And really our focus is simple. We focus on the lower middle market, companies with around $2 to $5 million of EBITDA. And we're just looking for sort of interesting, opportunistic investments. We're generalists, so we don't have a particular industry focus. And we really have a very long-term kind of value investor-oriented perspective of trying to buy great businesses, add value, and hold them over the long term. So that's what I'm up to.
Perfect. So what is one mistake that you see private equity firms or portfolio companies making, and what do you suggest to correct them?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I see folks doing all the time that at least I feel like can lead to suboptimal decisions. I don't know if I would fully classify them as mistakes, but just things that I sort of typically don't agree with. I think one of them is, and candidly, I think this is where we find a lot of opportunities. I think many PE firms are sometimes too rigid in both their approach to deals and opportunities. So they just have a really, really tightly defined box, which I understand why they have that. But a lot of times it leaves really compelling either opportunities that they just pass over for whatever reason. So that's sort of one potential mistake, which candidly we capitalize on all the time. The other is they often have a really rigid approach to deal making, which is sometimes goes hand in hand with that, but sometimes it's, a friend of mine likened it to Revolutionary War soldiers sort of lining up and everybody raised their musket and so to me, there's not a lot of subtlety and nuance in a lot of cases in the way that folks do deals. There's not a lot of focus and understanding in many instances of what the other side is really wanting to do or trying to accomplish. And again, I think that's a competitive advantage for us in a lot of transactions where we really try to pay attention to the seller and what they want to do and where they're trying to go. And sometimes that attention to them and their end game really creates an opportunity for us to a deal where maybe a larger, less subtle PE firm or, buyer would just have their approach. And if it doesn't fit, they just move on to the next thing. So to me, those are some mistakes I see folks making on the deal side. Again, maybe they don't consider them mistakes, but there's certainly decisions that we typically capitalize on, and we find opportunities that maybe take a little more TLC or nuance to understand. But that's where, in a lot of cases, we find value.
So to unpack in more detail, what examples have you got of the things that you're doing to bring that subtleness, to bring the nuances that's helping you close deals? Obviously, other than the guys that are not bringing that.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple illustrations of that. So, I mean, one would be even just from a deal flow standpoint, right? So if you look at something like the IT services sector, there's sort of a standard buy box of, hey, we're looking for, let's say 60% recurring revenue or more, right? So something falls below that, typically there's a pretty precipitous drop off in value, right? Because the larger institutional buyers, the folks looking for add-ons or whatever, it might be outside of that scope. So the question is then, okay, well, is there an opportunity to buy something that's just below that threshold at a meaningful valuation discount, and then over 12, 18, 24 months, whatever, bring it back up into that threshold, right? And so there's obviously some operational lift that has to go into that. But a lot of times around the fringes or just outside of the places where folks play, you can find opportunity. So that would be one. Another one, just in the deal making standpoint, is as I mentioned, if you're looking at something like deal structure or talking to a seller about what they're trying to accomplish, and it's a big ongoing roll up that just says, hey, this is our standard deal. You roll this and you get this, and da 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 da. It's like, okay, well, maybe there's some nuances the seller cares about that might impact. Okay, maybe they want to roll more equity or less equity, or maybe they, you give them more flexibility in the earnout or whatever. Or maybe their operational role is something that is outside the box of what you would have as sort of really rigid definition of it being. If you're willing to entertain those things and understand those things, I think it opens doors that a lot of times, if you're not willing to pry them open, just, remain closed.
I'm yet to meet a private equity investor that has been expertly trained in securing and attracting top talent for their portfolio companies. Therefore, I've written a brand new book exactly on that topic. I've collated all of the information from my years in executive search and spoken to some of the top private equity investors and put this all into a brand new book. We're giving away the first 100 copies to anyone who joins the waiting list. Check out the show notes and get your name down for this brand new book. So you mentioned deal origination there and a little bit of an insight to how you're approaching it. What are you guys doing that's maybe different to the typical deal origination processes of investment banks like you used to work in?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think we have a very wide approach to deal origination, right? So we do a lot of different stuff. I mean, everything from cold email, which I feel like has gotten relatively crowded, to LinkedIn, to direct mail, right? We bought a business actually that we sourced via direct mail. Network is always a big piece of that, and still also working with intermediaries, right? I mean, that's got to be a piece of the puzzle. But to me, being really successful at origination, I think, comes back to really starting with your market position, right? And your sort of brand, so to speak, right? And so if you have a market position that sellers resonate with, and you have more, you have sort of a perspective that they really get excited about, I think a lot of times that helps you differentiate yourself. So if you get an email, if you own a business, you get an email from 5 buyers, and you look at each of their bios really quickly, or their profiles or their firms or whatever, and one of them, like, I get people all the time that we send relatively generic outreach copy to that say, hey, for some reason, what you sent me really resonated, and I just felt like I wanted to talk to you, even though I get 5 of these a week or whatever, right? And so why is that? Is because we position ourselves in a way that, candidly, I think a lot of buyers can't, by using some of these strategies that I just hit on a second ago, right? So, and I didn't invent this market position. We basically borrowed it or stole it from Berkshire Hathaway and folks like that, right? This sort of idea of more kind of permanent equity approach to, hey, we're a long-term buyer. We're buy and hold typically, or try to be. We want to focus on making long-term value-oriented decisions for the companies that we invest in. And we also care to some extent about all of the different stakeholders that are a part of the puzzle. And so by doing that, folks see that in our messaging, our branding, and our positioning. And they also, the people who want to gravitate or orient towards something like that are more likely to want to respond to us, right? So we're almost, via our market position and our branding, quote unquote, positioning in ourselves in a way where our outreach copy is kind of resonating differently with people than, maybe even the same exact copy would resonate from somebody who's a big institutional firm that's just, and all. I think another piece of it too, and where I'm sort of giving away some of our strategies here, but like a lot of times, I think people also resonate more to a principal reaching out to them versus an analyst, right? Or somebody more junior, right? If you have somebody who's a year out of college doing your deal origination, a business owner isn't going to be that excited about talking to a bright-eyed analyst as they are about talking to a principal of the firm. And so by really enmeshing yourself in your outreach and your origination, I think you set yourself up to both have a better one-on-one relationship with the seller, but also increase the conversion rate of the seller's engagement with you, right? And so that's not necessarily easy, and it takes a lot of time. And I have a lot of seller conversations as a result of that. But the reality is, I think it ultimately builds better rapport and almost self-selects for people who care more about that stuff versus a more vanilla outreach strategy.
So interesting enough, you're the first private equity firm that I've ever heard that uses bulk mail in order to attract its portfolio companies. Give us a bit of an insight as to what kind of bulk mail you're doing. It's something we've done a little bit of, albeit we've had some horror stories with our outreach and stuff not getting there and realizing you can't send power banks with lithium batteries in abroad and all sorts of different things. But we've made a few mistakes on that one, so anybody listening, don't do that. But what have you done, Matt? Hopefully more successfully.
Yeah, I mean, so we're not always doing direct mail, but we've done a number of direct mail campaigns. We did a campaign maybe 2-3 years ago that we bought a business off of, and I'm happy. I mean, it's not terribly complicated. And then we also, that same campaign actually generated another deal that we had under LOI. Ultimately, the business performance had kind of a material adverse change during diligence, and so we ended up not continuing to pursue it. But that single campaign generated a purchase and an LOI that if there hadn't been a change, we would have probably closed on that deal as well. And so, the strategy is pretty simple, right? I mean, you probably experience something similar where, I get letters all the time in the mail that effectively say, hey, we want to buy your house, right? Or something to that effect, right? They're just kind of fishing. We apply the same strategy to businesses, right? Sort of send a letter that says, hey, here's who we are, here's what we're up to, we're interested in potentially buying your business. And in a weird way, direct mail is almost less crowded these days than email, right? I mean, it's more expensive, but at the same time, it's less crowded. And if you think about, depends a little bit on the industry sector that you're playing in, right? We play in a lot of more sort of old economy type businesses, manufacturing, distribution, that kind of stuff. A lot of times those business owners, especially if it's a baby boomer seller, they pay more attention to their mail than they do to their email in a lot of cases, right? Or LinkedIn or whatever. I see a lot of folks using really advanced level LinkedIn deal origination strategies, or trying to, and sometimes in sectors where it's like the seller doesn't even have a LinkedIn profile, right? Or if they do, it's like a no photo, it's just like their name and their company name, and there's virtually no information on there. Now, certain sectors, people are really active on LinkedIn, and it's a totally viable means of sourcing. But in others, you want to meet the sellers where they are, right? In a lot of cases, that's going more old school than you might otherwise go.
No, I like it. I like that approach a lot. They're kind of trying to differentiate things. You also reference brand in there, which isn't something that's discussed particularly in the private equity sphere away from the portfolio companies. So what have you guys done in order to, you've obviously done different strategies from a direct marketing campaign, but what have you done with regards to actually considering how you build your brand? And have you got a marketing team in there? Have you got to use outside sources in order to do that? Just to give us some context.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be, it's not terribly complicated, right? I think it's simple. It's not necessarily easy, right? Brand is all about what you stand for. What are you about? What are you doing, right? And our brand is really oriented towards the stuff I talked about before. Hey, we're very long-term oriented. We think about the stakeholders in the companies that we invest in. Every company we have, the management team, key folks have ownership. We even have some businesses with company-wide profit participation plans. Those things are really important to us. And so our market position or our brand is, hey, we're not a big institutional buyer, right? If you want to go sell for the top tick at a big auction, we're probably not the people that you want to call. If you're looking for a home, someone to shepherd the legacy of your business, to take care of your employees, to take care of your customers and your stakeholders, that's really where we shine is, hey, we're an alternative to a lot of the traditional buyers out there. And again, we didn't necessarily invent that brand or that market position. It's borrowed from the Berkshire Hathaways of the world. But probably after reading, one too many Warren Buffett shareholder letters, I eventually sort of thought that it would be a good idea for us to pursue that approach. I haven't even had that perspective for a very long time, but that's sort of how we informed our the construction of our brand, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then talked about brand, talked about deal origination. with regards to your deals, you've mentioned you have a level of flexibility on how you structure your deals. Do you guys have kind of quite a bit of flexibility with regards to the capital you use in order to deploy to basically make a deal work, even if it's slightly below where the EBITDA number should be, and if X, Y, and Z needs this and that?
To a decent extent. I mean, again, we are value investors, right? So, I mean, we probably are less flexible on bending around, this is a sort of a broad term, but like overpaying for something, right? That's typically not where we land. We really think about going all the way back to the old school concepts of like margin of safety, right? Sort of buying with a margin of safety, understanding, hey, we're investing in a way where we feel really confident going in, even if we're not some wizard operators that are going to like 5x EBITDA. Our strategy is about really having a very thoughtful, disciplined approach from a valuation standpoint. So I think that is an important piece of the puzzle. But we're more open around, again, whether it's employee equity or maybe the seller either wants to have more involvement or less involvement than maybe an institutional buyer may want. Every deal we do, for better or worse, and sometimes my attorneys yell at me for this, is very kind of custom tailored, sort of bespoke to that situation and that seller, that company, and the dynamics, versus having a really rigidly defined, more programmatic approach, which again, there's advantages to that. And that comes back to sort of the strategic choice that we make around our market position, and it being distinct from maybe a more programmatic, roll up of, hey, we're looking for this buy box, and anything outside of it, we just discard, and we're just looking for this one thing.
And you mentioned your reference to Berkshire Hathaway and the influences you've taken from Warren and obviously the late Charlie. Why have you adopted a longer term hold period rather than the standard private equity goal of 3, realistically 5, ends up being 7?
I like the way you phrased that, by the way. That's very accurate. Goal of 3, realistically 5, ends up being 7. That's a good perspective. I think that's just stolen straight from Berkshire, right? I mean, that's not rocket science. And it's not to say we don't divest things, right? It's just a function of, to me, really thought process and sort of what governs your decision making, right? So my fundamental belief is, if you're looking at making decisions over the medium to long term, you make better decisions for the business ultimately than if you're orienting towards a sale in 3 years, right? And a lot of times that sort of short-termism, I think, results in worse decisions, both at a micro level and a macro level, right? I mean, whether you're slashing budget or not investing in certain things because you really want to hit this target, because you really want to have the numbers look exactly this way so that you can sell, but then 18 months down the road, you didn't, invest in that one thing, or you didn't, give that customer what they needed or whatever, and then they end up attriting and it ends up creating compounded problems down the line. Our perspective is, hey, if we generally have a really long-term perspective, we think we make better, more rational decisions for the ultimate end game of the business. I think we also, we like cash flow, right? We want to invest, hold, generate cash flow with the idea of redeploying that into future opportunities versus sort of lumpy one-time liquidity events. And so that's generally our approach, right? And that, again, it's not to say we don't necessarily sell stuff. It's more, we think that ultimately you get a better creation of enterprise value with a long-term perspective than with a short-term fuse or a time horizon of having to sell in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years or whatever it is.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a quick mention of a long-standing partnership with Grata. As you will probably know, the private equity scene is constantly evolving, and deal flow is moving now to proprietary and data-driven processes. Grata provides you with the data and information of over 7 million private companies. So if you're looking to improve your proprietary deal flow and improve the data access, then reach out to Grata today. Now back to the podcast. So what are your influences, Matt? What do you read? What do you watch? What do you listen to? Do you recommend others check out, please?
I mean, I hit on a couple of them already, right? So probably a pretty common or, normal recommendation, but I've read pretty much everything, Warren Buffett's ever written. Berkshire Hathaway, huge Charlie Munger fan, read all of his stuff. I've gone super deep down kind of the Munger rabbit hole around psychology and, what he calls worldly wisdom, basically the mental models approach to understanding the world, and trying to build a really robust understanding of a lot of mental models, specifically from psychology, because humans influence and intersect with every element of business, but really broadly with, even things like economics, math, history, all that kind of stuff, just sort of trying to build a robust toolkit of mental models to understand reality better, right? So that ultimately we can make better decisions and create better outcomes. So that's something that I consume on a pretty recurrent, I've consumed historically a substantial amount of, right? Recently, what's been interesting me, I just recently finished reading the Brad Jacobs book, How to Make a Few Billion Dollars. I don't know if you've interacted with that or seen it, but
Nope.
Brad Jacobs, really fascinating guy, basically acquired, depending on how you look at it, because he's had a couple spin-offs, but somewhere between $4 and $7 billion companies over the last 40 years across a bunch of different industries, ranging from oil and gas to waste management to logistics. Really, really prolific entrepreneur. Wrote a book that came out this summer called How to Make a Few Billion Dollars. That was fascinating. Been thinking about that a lot lately, and then probably more indicative of just where we are in the market cycle, but paying pretty close attention to the Fed and the Wall Street Journal and rates and sort of what's going on there to kind of get a sense of the broader macro picture and whether or not we're, what the rate profile looks like over the next 6 to 24 months. Whether consumers, whether we have sort of a soft landing or there's sort of recession, whether there's consumer softening, all of these things are very top of mind for us. So just paying attention to both news sources, research reports from the usual suspects, investment banks, that kind of stuff, to try to get a perspective, and then just having dialogue with other people in the marketplace, sponsors, other investors, portfolio companies, right? Understanding, hey, what are you seeing on the ground? Are sales increasing? Are they decreasing? What's the consumer sentiment? What's the sentiment of vendors or customers? How are we seeing things kind of increasing? Are we seeing folks getting more cautious? Is capital investment increasing or decreasing, right? Trying to formulate a really robust and kind of multivariate tapestry of information so we can get the best approximation for where we are today and where things are heading. So a couple different things that are sort of top of mind, but those are a few that are kind of relevant as of right now.
Love that answer, Matt. That was incredibly detailed. I made a few notes there. Before we wrap up, what have you taken specifically? I mean, there'll be a lot, but I didn't know about Charlie Munger's writing on the psychology of of people, which I find fascinating. What are some of the, one or two takeaways that you've taken that have maybe done a bit of a shift for you or a different approach from you reading that?
Yeah, so that's a very deep rabbit hole if you want to pull on that thread. There's a book called Poor Charlie's Almanac that's kind of a starter on that front. It's not by Munger, but it's about Munger, and it's all about sort of his worldly wisdom framework for understanding reality. There's also a really good YouTube speech of Charlie Munger's from like the late 80s or early 90s. And I'll forget the exact number, but it's something to the effect of like the 27 standard causes of human misjudgment is what he calls it. And he goes through in this speech, I forget the original context which he gave it, but he goes through and lists 27 basically cognitive biases and gives real life illustrations of them in a bunch of different business examples and contexts. It's a fascinating speech. I probably listened to it 25 times. And from there, he talks about a couple other resources and things to really dig into if you want to unpack human behavior and understand it better. A couple resources that I've personally found really helpful. One of the kind of seminal books on this front is Influence by Robert Cialdini. It's probably 20 years old at this point, but it talks about some of the really core pillars of human influence. Another really good book on this is Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. And really anything by Cialdini or anything by Ariely, but all of those will get you started on the journey of kind of understanding human behavior and irrationality and psychology and all of this stuff. And then it really depends on where you want to go from there in the journey in terms of whether you want to understand decision-making better or whether you want to understand sort of influence and getting people to do more or less what you want to do. There's also a really good Robert Greene book. I want to say, I forget the title of it, but it's something like The Laws of Human Behavior or something. That's not what it is, but it's something to that effect. That's like a very detailed, basically study of psychology and decision making and human behavior and all that kind of stuff. But I like to borrow from a lot of different areas, I guess, to unpack some of that stuff. I really find the influence side of things to be super interesting, and I think it's also really relevant to deal making and investing and negotiation and buying businesses. And Influence by Cialdini is kind of a classic in that front. But even delving into some fields like hostage negotiation, like Chris Voss is a great resource around some stuff like that. His book Never Split the Difference is really compelling, all the way to things like spy recruitment and looking at how do people recruit spies? How do people get double agents? How do people get people to turn on their country? I forget the name of his book, but there's an author named Robin Dreeke, Dreeke, who has a couple different books. I think The Code of Trust is one of them, that talk about this idea of basically convincing people to turn on their countries and how to do it, right? And so the lessons from doing that and things like hostage negotiation, where these really high stakes dynamics, can be really applicable to deals and negotiation in the more mundane aspects of the world.
That's it. Well, I've written down a hell of a lot of book recommendations there, Matt. So I think I'll be listening back to this myself, to cutting out my bit and listening certainly to the book recommendation you said there. So thank you very much for the incredibly detailed. Thank you for everything, but specifically, if I can say that. Thank you very much for all the book details. And I love people incredibly well read. It really broadens the mind. It really allows you to talk about loads of different subjects and topics. And I'm sure, Matt, there's many people who've had a few beers with you and opened up that mind and all that level of reading. But I can't remember who was that said this. I think it was actually Jordan Peterson on a podcast, and he was like, I was able to read in an hour and a half something that took somebody 30 years to research and learn. And it's like, start from where they finished and go on from that perspective. And it's all in the power of books. We've got so many tools, and obviously the podcast is one of them, but I'm a big believer in reading. And I've just started, which is one of, I'm going to forget who recommended it, but Extreme Ownership. I've just literally started that.
Oh, love that book.
Jocko Willink, literally started.
Phenomenal.
Today, so.
The audiobook is also really good if you like audiobooks at all. But yeah, Extreme Ownership's one of my all-time favorites. I've given that to the management teams of a couple different businesses of ours over time as well. I think it's a really good read.
Even better choice, but it was recommended on the podcast, hence why I dived in. So, well, thank you for that, Matt. How best do people reach out to you, should they wish to do so, for probably more book recommendations at the very least?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about deal making and all the sort of nuances, elements, strategies of buying businesses. I have a free newsletter called the Deal Mastery Insider. It's just at mattbodnar.com. You can sign up right on the homepage. And for folks who want more of my esoteric, perspectives on doing deals, and we talk about sort of psychology, strategy, all kinds of different stuff, all topics that I find personally really interesting and occasionally apply to the world of private equity as well. That's all in my newsletter.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for coming on and sharing everything that you have. And I really appreciate you coming on the Private Equity Podcast, Matt.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thank you so much for having me on the show and letting me share a few of these insights and ideas.
Pleasure's absolutely all ours. And thank you very much to all of our listeners for again tuning in to the Private Equity Podcast. Till the next time, keep smashing it. And thank you very much for listening.